On a sun-scorched afternoon in 1867, Fazenda Santa Rita arranged its most brilliant deception. A wedding so radiant it could pretend the plantation's violence was a different story entirely. Guests arrived in clean white shirts, pocket watches glinting, strings of jasmine were threaded between eaves and banisters. The Casa Grande's polished floors reflected chandeliers until the room seemed a second sky. Beneath that sky, in a long room behind the lantern light and the music, another kind of labor hummed. The steady, unseen industry that supplied every plate, every wife's fan, every toast. It was in that space, between cauldron steam and the clatter of pans, that Benedita moved like a shadow with purpose, watching the day as if she had always read the weather in the faces of the powerful. Humiliated for years, until she took her revenge on her wedding day. The story would later be told not as a single act, but as a slow turning. A life pared down by grief, sharpened by knowledge, and finally aimed. On the morning of the celebration, Benedita's hands smelled of coffee and citrus peel. Her palms were marked with the memory of a rope and the clean abrasion of years spent on wooden boards. She carried a small folded cloth in her apron, a thing of cotton wrapped so simply you could mistake it for rag. And it was precisely that. Ordinary, invisible, something meant to be unseen. From the path that led from the Engenho to the Casa Grande, the estate spread like a map of possession. Cane fields rose in wind-sculpted ranks, the mill's shallow roar a heartbeat in the distance. The Casa Grande sat at the highest point, a white rectangle of authority with windows that caught light and eyes. Below, the Cenzala clustered together on lower ground, like a secret map of lives meant to be kept out of the view. Men and women walked that map in work shoes and bare feet, voices measured to the rhythm of tasks. They shared tricks of mending, songs that threaded the day, and the small economies of silence. Who would spare a piece of cassava? Who would keep for another night a spoon of sugar? Coronel Joaquim de Almeida spent his days as though the world were a list of ritual comforts: a morning cup of coffee, a midday inspection of the cane, a certain hour for the receipt of letters. He carried his rule like an old medal, the authority of inheritance hardened into habit. His daughter Isabel bloomed under that authority. 17, pale-skinned, wrapped in muslin and laurels, viewing the world as porcelain objects learned to view hands that caress. The groom, a young lawyer who had come from the coastal town with dreams of estate marriage and social consolidation, smiled in a way practiced by those who imagined themselves already secure. Between Isabel's laugh and the lawyer's neat coat, the Casa Grande rehearsed a future that would not acknowledge the hands that had made it possible. Inside the kitchen, voices were softer, because softness had to be practiced to survive. Benedita moved in that quiet like an instrument well tuned to the house's cadence. She had learned to work in the thin creases of the day, when no one else needed her, before the staff arrived, when the servants changed shifts, when the colonel drank his private coffee. It was in those hours she watched, the tilt of his cup, the way he rolled his tongue over a bitter sip, the small scowl if the roast was not to his liking, a detail to most, a map to her. A few steps from Benedita, in the shade of a low eave, Joanna Grosser tended a cluster of potted leaves and roots, her fingers sure as a midwife's. The elder woman's hair was braided back and silvered. Her voice carried the authority of many winters. She had been called many names in the Cenzala: healer, woman of the mater, custodian of the things the Casa Grande would never admit to needing. Her knowledge was sifted from years of necessity: which leaves eased fever, which root soothed a fevered child, which bark could staunch a wound. She spoke little of how she learned. What mattered was that her hands could translate the land into comfort. Benedita had come to Joanna after the worst of her childhood. When she was small, her mother Mariana had been the center of her world, a woman whose laugh found the corners of a room even when sorrow sat heavy. Mariana would sing at dawn while she bent to weave a basket or stir a pot. She taught Benedita the names of birds, the softness of cassava flour, the way to fold a cloth so it would not lose its shape. There had been evenings in which mother and daughter lay under coarse blankets and counted the tiny lights of the plantation as if a different constellation could answer a different prayer. One winter, if one could call the heat of Bahia winter, the fever came to Mariana. It arrived slowly, then with a stubborn force, a hush to her voice, a heat to her skin, a weakness that rusted her step. Benedita, small and frantic, begged for help. She went to the Casa Grande and found the colonel, who stood in the doorway as if the walls were another kind of possession. She told him her mother was sick and needed treatment. He shrugged as though that would be an appropriate posture for people who owned land, and not for those who had children dying. The doctor, summoned at his convenience, glanced at Mariana from the veranda, as if he counted her pulse against the ledger he kept in his head. Everything was late, and when it mattered, its lateness was a sentence. Mariana died without a hand from the Casa Grande to steady hers, and the grief in Benedita's chest folded clean and cold. It was not only the loss, it was the humiliating fact that her plea had been treated like any other trivial noise. The colonel's refusal marked a change. Grief became a teacher. The lesson was private and terrible. Mariana's absence tightened Benedita's spine in a way that left her still but calculating. She began to hold details, the exact hour the colonel liked his coffee, the manner he set his napkin, the servant he favored for small tasks. The small daily rituals of the powerful are maps for those who watch. It was Joanna Grosser who recognized the shape that grief was becoming. She invited Benedita to sit, to learn the names of roots and leaves, not as curiosities, but as a language. Her instruction was slow as the turning of a spool. Scent first, then texture, then stories of what certain plants had done in the past. Joanna would point to a leaf and say, "This will cool a fever," and to a bark, "This will steady a breathing." She never spoke in recipes, never spelled out steps. Her words were fragments of a living archive. "This root makes the heart lurch when taken too strong," she might say, and leave the sentence like a stone that would be picked up later only by those who knew which hands to use. Under Joanna's tutelage, knowledge became a kind of resistance. It was understood that the Casa Grande would never credit the Cenzala's wisdom, that any benefit would be reallocated to servants without acknowledgement. So the teaching took the form of secrecy and economy. Benedita learned to carry a memory rather than a trunk of tools, how bark felt between thumb and forefinger, the way a certain smell could be both a salve and a signal. Joanna pressed upon her the ethics of such knowledge. It could heal as easily as it could harm. It was to be kept from eyes that would weaponize or trivialize it. "We hold what we must," Joanna said, and the words were neither sermon nor law, but a pact. In the years that followed, Benedita practiced restraint as a craft. She moved through the house so as not to be noticed, which is different from invisibility. It is the careful choosing of where to be seen and when. She learned to fade behind the linen curtains when guests arrived, and to be present where her presence would be mistaken for only ordinary service. There were insults she weathered. A hand that struck her back for a misplaced dish, a public joke about a servant's accent. But there were also subtler wounds, the daily reminder that every labor was assumed and every credit taken. The Cenzala taught its young ones to translate humiliation into lessons, when to speak, when to hold silence, and how to make patience into a slow, strategic line of force. The colonel continued his small rituals, his confidence hardened by decades of unchallenged control. He loved the coffee made for him in the morning like an altar rite, the cup warmed between his hands while he surveyed his domain. He wore his authority casually, almost as a luxury, an easy assumption that the world would rearrange to his comfort. The wedding announcement, when it came, was like a declaration of perpetuation. Isabel's marriage would be a new knot binding the Almeida fortunes to another house, an investment of social capital. The Casa Grande buzzed with preparations. New linens arrived from the port. Men were hired to lay a temporary floor in the courtyard. A string quartet was contracted to travel 3 days for the performance. For the Cenzala, the wedding meant long hours and little rest. Men and women were assigned to clean, to cook, to arrange. Musicians would warm up under porticos they would never enter. Plates would be polished until the reflection of the chandeliers multiplied into constellations no one could claim. Benedita observed all of it, from within the work. She watched how people moved, the ways the colonel relaxed his guard as he allowed himself to be flattered, the manner in which the guests were distracted by spectacle. Opportunity, she learned, is often nested inside distraction. There were moments that tested Benedita's restraint, episodes that might have drawn a different kind of reply from a less tempered heart. Once, in the weeks before the wedding, the colonel summoned the kitchen staff to an inspection. He walked among the tables, picking at a stew and scoffing at the roughness of a ham. He spoke loudly enough for some to hear. "If I had my way, I'd have better hands than these. Discipline, order. One needs it to run a place like this." His insult landed like a gavel, the sort of remark meant less for correction than for reassertion. Benedita stood with a tray in her hands, her fingers folded around the lip, feeling the old flash of heat behind her eyes. She thought of her mother's empty bed, and of the doctor who had come when the colonel had found it convenient, and she thought of the way Joanna's hands had shown her that some roots pull one's breath away. But Benedita had learned that violence executed at the wrong time could only return one deeper into the circle of punishment. She remembered Joanna's warning about visibility. "A quick scream makes you known," Joanna told her once. "But known is a dangerous thing here." That was the cunning instruction. To be visible where it served, and invisible where it saved life. So Benedita anchored herself to patience. She watched habits. Which servant the colonel favored when he wanted flattery? When the young lawyer slipped from conversation to look at the accounts, when Isabel waved to someone across the room, and above all, which cup the colonel preferred for those moments he felt most like a sovereign. As the days shortened toward the wedding, Benedita's attention tightened into a single thread. She began to time details. When the colonel would take his private cup before the main table was set, the hour his steps softened as he allowed himself a second of pleasure. Her memory catalogued these things like beads on a string. Objects, too, were recorded. The pattern of the service plates, the drawer where fine linens were kept, the small wooden tray used for private drinks. She catalogued the comings and goings of the physician who had once examined her mother with an absent hand. He arrived now as a guest of reputation to ensure that the colonel's health was beyond question. These were not merely practical observations, they were the architecture of possibility. There were friends in the Cenzala whose presence steadied her. Young boys and girls, older men with hands scarred from cane-cutting, women who had been delivering babies since before Benedita was born. They kept a murmur going beneath the official noise. They told stories of escape routes and of small kindnesses, and they provided a chorus that could name what had happened when one of their own vanished. When word arrived that the colonel had refused to help Mariana, no official record preserved the family's sorrow. Only the Cenzala catalogued it in memory. Mariana was a steady one elder would say, and the next line of the song would fold her back into the story where she was alive, stubborn, and teaching a child to count the days by the position of the sun. Joanna Grosser, in particular, watched Benedita with an affection that was part pride, part concern. She respected Benedita's restraint, but knew the weather of a human heart when it hardened into a plan. One evening, as the orange light of dusk softened the sugar fields into a wash of gold, Joanna said to her, "You carry much weight like you carry pots, balanced so you don't spill. But remember, the earth will keep its own counsel, and so must you." Benedita nodded, but she did not speak of what she was holding in her mind. She had wrapped a small parcel once, late at night, and held it against her chest as if it were a child. It was a root, dark and dense, its shape irregular as a thought. She had not asked Joanna to prepare it. She had not told Joanna exactly what she planned to do with it. The bond between them was not one of confession, but of recognition. The elder saw the intent and measured it, placing it beside caution. The plantation's rhythm carried them toward the day. The Casa Grande sprouted decorations, tradesmen hammered in the courtyard, travelers began to arrive with trunks of lace and bread. There were whispers among the staff that the colonel was in a particularly buoyant mood, that he had been photographed in his yacht in the city, and now told tales of future political appointments. Privilege multiplies the cadence of its own myth. Benedita watched him with a new sort of clarity, not hatred in the way that burns and consumes, but a cold arithmetic comprehension of the mechanics of power. He was a man confident that accidents belonged to other people, that harm visited only those whose names were not written in the ledgers. One afternoon, as the wedding drew near, the colonel held a small reception where the Casa Grande guests drank a first taste of the banquet. Benedita served from the edge of the crowd, a practiced smile placed as if to keep any suspicion at bay. The colonel joked with the lawyer about land titles, and Isabel fluttered a fan as if to encourage the exchange of compliments. When the colonel lifted his private cup, a cup he favored for sake of solitude more than for any reason of taste, Benedita felt an old muscle of readiness tighten. In the way the cup steamed, she read the colonel's little moment of self-regard. She read where he placed his hands, how he leaned back in the chair and permitted himself that luxury of unexamined contentment. That cup was, for him, a private altar. The Chanzala whispered of risk and reward the way neighbors whisper about storms. Some spoke in scorn, some in fear, some in a cold admiration. "If she does this thing, there will be no looking back," one woman said in the evening as they mended shirts. Another shook her head and lowered her voice. "We hold our stories for safekeeping, not to be burned." People judged in the way people do among the oppressed, not from the position of a judge's robe, but from the complicated place of survival. Benedita felt the heat of their eyes like added weather on her skin. She had the sense that the very community that had taught her restraint might be the only witness to what she would do. In the final days before the wedding, Benedita refined small movements into a choreography of ordinariness. She timed when to pass a platter, so no one noticed the linen fold in her apron. She learned where the musicians would tune their violins, so their sound masked the small noises of the kitchen. She set down a saucer where the colonel's private cup would rest for only a minute before it moved into his hand. In the hush between two tasks, she would press her fingers into the cloth that hid the root, and feel the texture like a favor given and kept. Joanna watched her prepare and said nothing that would instruct, only an observation like a pebble placed in a stream. "There are roads you cannot return from," she said once, her eyes steady on Benedita's hands. Benedita did not reply. There are moments in a life when words cannot hold the shape of the decision. The body proceeds on another axis. Benedita's body had become a ledger of small transactions. When to step forward, when to hold back, how to convert pain into attention. The morning of the wedding dawned with too much brightness. The white of the Casa Grande seemed calmed into brilliance by the sun. Guests took the paths like actors entering a new scene, their shoes muffled by dust. Servants arranged bouquets near the entrance. A man polished the step until it reflected his face, in the way a spoon reflects the sun. Benedita moved through the kitchen with the composure of someone who had been here many times before. She was not a figure of melodrama, but a woman of purpose. She set the coffee she had prepared aside for the colonel, placing it upon the small tray that always traveled with him when he chose privacy before a meal. Steam rose in pale curls that carried the scent of roasted beans and a hint of bitterness, a smell that had been an instrument of his authority. Benedita's hands were steady as a maker's should be. Outside music began to thread itself across the veranda. The quartet tuned, a soft hum that made the china clink like distant chimes. Guests laughed in rehearsed contentment, their conversations floating above the workrooms like floating birds. Inside, Benedita took the tray and arranged the cups. Her fingers brushed the cloth in her apron. The parcel was a private hot iron against her side. For a second, as she moved through the small door that led to the colonel's private room, she felt the weight of all her years. The house smelled of citrus and oil, and a future that sought to fix itself in place. She stepped into the colonel's presence as if into light that would reveal or perhaps forgive. She had rehearsed the sequence of small movements so many times in her mind that it had become a quiet liturgy, spare, efficient, utterly ordinary. The colonel looked up at her, image complete, expression of a man used to being served by hands that made him invisible. He did not look at her as a subject who could alter the world. He looked at her as a transient figure necessary to the functioning of his life. He held his cup, and Benedita watched the color of the coffee move like a small dark planet in the white cup. There is a kind of terror that steadies the hand. There is also a kind of sorrow that stills it. Benedita felt both. At the threshold between the private and the public, she paused. For an instant, the house seemed to hang between breaths, the distant notes of a violin, the hum of guests outside, the slow tick of a clock. She kissed a corner of the folded cloth with no ritual but the one she needed, and tucked it deeper into her apron as if it might be hidden in plain sight. The colonel sipped. The moment held like a photograph. Benedita's mouth was dry. Her mind was a lake of stillness. She moved back into the kitchen, a vessel carrying what everyone else assumed to be merely a tray. And then, as if the day had been waiting for a single chord, the door opened and the world resumed its cadence. Voices lifted, footsteps quickened. Someone outside called for the musician to begin. Benedita stood just beyond the arc of the Casa Grande's light, unseen as one of the many hands that made such brightness possible. She folded her apron and placed the tray upon the counter, and in the brief lull that followed the colonel's private cup, she smoothed the cloth at her waist, feeling the parcel there like a small heart beating in time with her own. If you want more untold stories from history, subscribe. The crowd filled the courtyard, the air becoming a tapestry of perfumes and laughter. Isabel descended the interior steps like a vision in lace, moved by a procession of well-wishing faces. The lawyer stood rigid with the kind of hope that considered every gain permanent. Beneath the spectacle, the Casa Grande's guests praised the colonel for the magnificence of the affair. They spoke of family, of proper unions, of futures being stitched in silk. No one looked toward the kitchen, except in the utilitarian way of those who measure labor in output rather than human presence. Benedita felt the pressure around the house concentrate. The music swelled, the toasts practiced their lines. The doctor delivered an affected comment about the colonel's fine health. Each movement outside was a screen for what she had chosen to carry. She crossed the service corridor like a narrow animal, a body in the margins. Her heart did not race in the way a novice's might. It beat in a steady, practiced manner. The parcel in her apron was neither miracle nor monster. It was an object of consequence that had been carefully guarded in the privacy of her own decision. As the banquet began, Benedita took up a ladle and moved among the servers with the ease of someone performing a dance she had rehearsed all her life. Plates slid down the line. The colonel lifted his glass and made a toast to alliances and the prosperity of the estate. The music swelled like tide, and Benedita could feel the swell in her chest, mimicking the measure of the chorus outside. Her hands were steady as plates were passed, as conversations hummed. When she reached the point where the colonel's private cup would be returned to its tray, she moved with the ordinary grace that had once been rewarded by gratitude and now bore a different, quieter fruit. The Casa Grande, extravagant and unbothered, exhaled in its normal rhythms. Benedita stayed at the edges of these rhythms, a presence the guests would not account for in their memoirs. She watched the colonel raise his eyes to the musicians and smile with the small beam of a man secure in his triumphs. She remembered Mariana's face in the hospital light of a past winter, and Joanna's low admonition about a road without return. 100 small images layered her vision like transparency sheets. She was both present and removed. Her body was a map of years, and the map had been folded into the small cloth at her waist. No one noticed the way the wind shifted that afternoon, carrying jasmine to the windows, carrying the laughter of those who thought the world a circle that would always come back to their feet. In the kitchen, a tray clinked against a counter. Benedita wiped her hands on her apron and drew her fingers into the fold at her waist where the parcel rested. The music swelled into a refrain, and the courtyard filled with the brightness of a life assumed secure. She stepped out, as she always had, to place a plate at the foot of a guest, and in that motion she felt the weight of choice close around her like a cloak. Outside, under the chandeliers and the sun, the wedding glittered like an argument. Inside, beneath the same light, Benedita's small darkness was ready. She had learned how to make patience into armor and knowledge into a quiet weapon. She had learned which moments of order could be broken in ways that would not return the fracture to the hands who made the house possible. She had done the patient arithmetic of timing, years of observation condensed into the measured geometry of a single day. The moment before the service began to swell into its loudest note, Benedita stood at the threshold of the house's service door and watched the colonel laugh at a story his guests told. She held her apron lightly, feeling the parcel like a heartbeat. Around her the servants moved in rehearsed patterns, but in her mind a new choreography had taken hold, not the kind the house rewarded with coins, but the kind that rewired the map by which power moved. She was not thinking of cruelty as a pleasure. She was thinking of an end to a long surveillance of pain, of a correction that the law of the land had refused to administer. The music tightened. The colonel raised his glass once more. Benedita inhaled a breath of jasmine and coffee and sweat, the scents of the Casa Grande knitted together into a single, terrible perfume. She stepped into the corridor that led from the kitchen toward the private room, her hands folded. Outside, someone called for a toast. Inside, the house's machinery of spectacle continued its work, oblivious to the fact that one small seam had been altered. She had waited for this hour as a storm waits for the right wind. Her face remained composed. Her body was a lesson in the use of stillness. She moved forward not with the triumph of vengeance, but with the heavy, patient relief of a debt collected after years of bearing interest. The house did not know its new balance had been set. The guests did not suspect the ledger had been adjusted in silence. Benedita passed between bright skirts and bowed heads, as if she were only the hand that moved plates and cups. And at the precise moment the colonel raised his cup to issue his toast to inheritance and security, Benedita stood in the doorway of the private room and looked at a man who had never believed the margins held such power. She felt the parcel tied into the small of her waist, like a secret nailed to her skin. She caught his eye and found his expression untroubled, practiced. He did not look for what he could not imagine. The world outside exhaled into its cluster of voices. Benedita's chest moved slowly. She had come to this point not as a fury, but as a ledger-keeper who had collected one account that the law had refused to balance. She was about to return to the kitchen with a composed face, a tray held level, her hands steady. The music rose, the guests lifted their glasses, the colonel prepared to speak. For a full breath the plantation was one glittering present. And then, as if the day had been waiting for an invisible hand to close a circle, Benedita took a single, ordinary step back into the shadow of the corridor and felt the parcel at her waist, as if it had the weight of all the years she had ever been unnoticed. She had not yet executed what she had planned. The instant hung heavy and taut. The wedding's brightness receded into the hum of ceremony, and in the kitchen the spoons were still. A single violin note trembled the air. Benedita's mouth was dry. Her mind, forged by the silence of loss and the instruction of Joanna Grossa, moved with a patience that had learned to be strategic. Outside, the colonel began to speak. Inside, Benedita smoothed the fabric at her waist and prepared, in the small way that is every human being's last control, to step back into the work of the day. The moment had arrived that would test the shape of everything that came before it. Grief, learning, secrecy, and the long arithmetic of a woman who had been humiliated for years. She moved as the room filled with attention, her body a quiet instrument of a choice that would ricochet beyond the Casa Grande's white walls, into the cane, the chandeliers, the mouths of those who would one day tell the tale in low voices around fires. Her mind carried only the measure of what must be done next. The wedding continued. The colonel's voice swelled in the courtyard. Benedita stood in the corridor with the parcel against her hip, steady as the world turned. The decision had been made. The act had not yet been taken. The house had not yet learned how fragile its certainty could be. She moved with the same ordinary choreography she had always practiced, tray balanced, shoulders level, eyes lowered in the practiced humility that had been taught to keep the house's eyes from cataloguing her as a person. The private room's door was a sliver of shade. The colonel's back was to her as he stood to lift the cup. For Benedita, action and stillness braided into a single posture. A slight bend at the elbow, a tilt of the head that signaled deference. In the space of a breath, she unwrapped the cloth at her waist. What she carried was never described as spectacle. It was small, dark, the shape of a thing gathered from earth and patience. She did not need to grind or to count. She needed only that the parcel touch the rim of what the colonel would lift to his lips. The parcel brushed the porcelain as a thought might brush a name. There was no flourish, no confession, only the slender, ruthless economy of concealment. He drank, he tasted. For a fleeting second his expression did what old mansions teach, a man pleased by his own comforts, then the private relaxation that comes from being believed right about the world. The cup touched his lips. The music outside swelled. Glasses were raised. A guest laughed at a joke about traveling judges. The colonel's face held the peace of a man assured by ritual. Then the day reshaped itself. At first it was a slackening, an eye that lost focus, a hand that no longer matched the motion of his mouth. A cough, or something like a cough, broke into the toast. The colonel's smile stuttered. Isabel's hand reached toward him as if to steady a child. In the crowded courtyard, the laughter dropped like a stone into a well. People are quick to explain unusual things with the vocabulary they have, perhaps a faint from the heat, perhaps an old complaint. The physician moved first, his practiced frown unlocking into something sharper, professional, urgent. He was a man who had once attended a dying woman from a veranda. Now he stepped into the center of attention as if the house's etiquette had provided him the right to judge bodies. There was no sudden cinematic collapse. The moment was more complicated than drama allows. The colonel swayed, his chair scraping in a noise that was like a small animal's cry. Hands went to shoulders, linen rustled, a napkin fell from the colonel's lap and unfurled like a pale flag. Someone called for water, someone else called for the doctor. Benedita watched from a doorframe as though she watched weather, observant, private, not seeking an audience. Her heart did not hammer in the way fear makes it pound. Rather, it remained an even, measured count, because what she had done was a culmination of years of quiet arithmetic. The physician checked a wrist, placed a hand to a cheek, spoke a sentence with a tone that closed a puzzle. "It is sudden. He has taken ill." That was the word the family wanted, an acceptable phrase with which to shape grief into propriety. The crowd folded around that phrase and learned how to behave. Chairs were drawn, servants were pushed gently aside, a cousin folded his scarf over his mouth as if to guarantee himself control. Isabel's sob was curatorial, well-placed, instructive. She was the theatrical daughter learning how to sculpt private pain into public lineage. The guests murmured, then hushed, then began to make conjectures phrased around the colonel's lifelong habits. The whiskey at night, the meals of privilege, the long years of stress he claimed to bear as though it were a medal. No one spoke the word the Cenzala would later use around small fires. Justice. That name wasn't spoken in the Casa Grande. It was the kind of language caged beneath polished furniture. The physician, his hands steady and his training a garment that fit him well, pronounced a verdict that the household could accept without looking too closely. A sudden, cardiac event. And with that pronouncement, the house reconstituted the event into something that left the servants invisible as always, and the cause impersonal. In the kitchen, dishes were polished with the mechanical diligence of a world that must maintain feeding even in the face of loss. Benedita moved back among the pans with the same grace that had initially brought her courage. Her face did not collapse into triumph. It tightened into something like a tolling bell. This was done, now what would be left? There were first procedures the Casa Grande performed in any death. Curtains were slightly dimmed. A hush was taught to the staff. The body was prepared to be moved into the open room where mourning would become display. Friends of the colonel came forward with condolences that smelled faintly of calculation. Every word was shorthand for a future where estates remained intact. The lawyer among the guests asked practical questions in his steady voice. How soon the funeral? Who will preside over the papers? The conversation pivoted away from the particularities of a human life into the things that sustained property and inheritance. The Cenzala, in its lower ground, did not receive the physician's verdict as an explanation, but as a sign. It was not the only account in the world with authority. For them, the scene had other names: the slowing of a breath, the hand that failed to move, the sudden end of a man whose comforts had been built on the daily labor of others. They had watched him refuse aid to Mariana, had stored the image like a coin, her hand unheld as she fevered, his indifference carved as easily as a room's furniture. The colonel's death slid into the Cenzala's ledger as a correction of sorts, a balancing that was quiet, swift, and without the name of law. Whispers began immediately. Someone saw Benedita pass the cup. Someone else remembered her pausing near the private room. A child swore that they saw a woman with a cloth at her waist shift her weight before the colonel swilled his drink. Rumors in that community were not evidence. They were the beginning of a different archive, one written in songs and folded cloths. Joanna Grosser listened to the murmurings with the same steady face she had always worn. She did not scold. She did not insist the much quieter narrative be concealed. Instead, she gathered the women and sang a soft rhythm that made the memory safe. Their voices braided the fact into myth, naming it so the story could be kept from being stolen by those who would otherwise erase it. Benedita did not wait for accusations. She had long understood that staying in the margins was the only protection left to those who might be suspected. In the hours between the colonel's last toast and the arrangement of mourning, she began to remove herself piece by measured piece, not in a rush that would draw eyes and hands, but in a manner consistent with the other things she had to pretend to be doing. She wound a scarf into a shape and laid it upon a bed. She folded a blanket and tucked it into a chest. Each motion could be read as a servant's ordinary tidying, and that was precisely the point. Her efficiency made her mundane. At dusk, when the Casa Grande lit the candles that would illuminate grief, her bed in the Cenzala lay as she had left it earlier. A single square of cloth folded and placed upon the pillow would become the small testimony she left behind. It was a thing both to mark departure and to erode suspicion. A woman who leaves a household often leaves a bed empty. But to leave quickly, along the cane row or out by the back road, would require a haste visible to the house's watchers. Benedita chose instead an escape that matched the skills she had. A route used by harvesters, known to those who collected the canes at night. A set of hands who had argued with the colonel, and yet who could be bribed by a look rather than coin. Her departure in the later hours was ghost-like. She stepped away while the household occupied itself with funeral arrangements, and the family folded their faces into mourning like linens. She passed through shadows she had learned as a child, through hedges of hibiscus and the low shelter where the mill workers washed. A boy who had been a friend since childhood, one who had once been saved from a cane scar by Benedita's quick bandage, provided a small boat and a pair of hands to push it into the river under the cover of a moon reduced to a silver tooth. He did not ask. He had seen what the colonel could do to those who disobeyed. He pushed, and she slid into the boat with a grace that belied the weight on her chest. There are many ways to leave a house, and this was one of the quieter kinds. No pyre, no dramatic window, only the slow receding of a boat against the sound of reeds. The plantation's lights dimmed, and then receded behind her like a piece of theatre, and the world reduced to the faint hiss of water and the soft breath of the rower. The river carried her north as if answering the whisper of a remembered song. Reeds stroked the hull like old friends. Behind her the Casa Grande would continue to misname the movement, folding the absence into an account of one more servant who left a household. In the days that followed, the Almadas, Isabel and the lawyer, performed the rituals expected of the bereaved. They called in priests, set up a viewing that was more a display of proper mourning than a reckoning. The colonel's body lay in the great room beneath a canopy and bouquets that asserted the family's taste and its right to grief. Neighbors came, relatives consoled, and the ledger of the estate was adjusted to show him as a man gone but with a line of inheritors ready to step into his shoes. Official inquiries were perfunctory. A coroner's note was signed, papers were stamped, and the physician who declared the colonel's end wrote his notes with a steady hand. If questions were raised, if a cousin asked why the colonel had sipped his private cup alone in that hour, the family smoothed them into acceptance with a clarity that came from habit. The law at the time preferred to treat such deaths as accidents or old men's fate. It did not look for hidden hands where servants stood in their customary invisibility. It was not negligence alone that preserved that innocence. It was the social apparatus that preferred its stories uncomplicated. Within the Cenzala, however, the story took on other shapes. Benedita's departure was a kind of secret sewn into the community. Some said she had stolen north to a Quilombo, a maroon community, places where those who had fled plantation life sometimes found new lives in dense woods or along riverbeds. Others said she had gone to Salvador and taken a job among dock workers, invisible again, but with the law's protection of anonymity. A few imagined she had stayed hidden in the Mata, living under a different name, tending to sick children and bleeding, teaching new generations the medicines Joanna had taught her. None of these versions could be proven. That was the point. The lack of proof made her legend bulletproof. Oral memory is generative. Around fires, the women of the Cenzala wove the tale into their pattern songs. They sang of a woman who had carried grief like a sack of grain and then, with a small, considerately executed act, rebalanced scales that the courts could not touch. Children learned the story as part instruction, part lullaby, to be careful, to catalogue, to hide knowledge when the world would misuse it, and, when necessary, to use that knowledge to protect themselves and their own. Joanna Grossa would tell the younger ones a verse that began in her own time and ended with Benedita's step out into the river. We keep what keeps us, roots, songs, names. The line functioned like a map and a warning. Time has a way of folding public memory and private record into different shapes. The Casa Grande produced an epitaph for the colonel that praised his virtues and minimized his cruelties. Photographs of his face in the parlor showed him as serious and dignified, a man of his station. The Cenzala retained a different portrait, a list of small injuries wrapped into one long ache, and then, finally, an accounting that returned a measure of balance. The plantation itself grew older, the cane fields renewing and growing brittle. The mill's shallow roar a sound more of habit than of industry. Joanna Grossa lived long enough to see the story move from rumour into a kind of legend. She tended her plants, watched children grow into adults, and continued to teach the names of leaves that eased fever and roots that steadied breath. She would not speak of the exact evening on which Benedita left. Some things were not to be pinned down, but she would hum the old rhythms, and if anyone asked her whether she had known what would happen that day, she only smiled in a way that acknowledged a complicated truth. Knowledge is a burden and a gift, and sometimes it must be chosen. Isabel, the colonel's daughter, married and learned the codified sorrow of inheritance. There were awkward months when her father's seat at the table was expected to be felt as an absence. She cultivated an attitude of propriety, and over time turned to the management of land as if the colonel's harshness could be translated into competence. The lawyer who had married her kept accounts and ensured that the ledger of property moved cleanly from line to line. They spoke in public about loss and about duty, and never much about culpability. The language of social preservation has its own appetite for forgetting. The physician's career continued too. He wrote a paper about the colonel's death that was technical and devoid of the social anxieties that had shaped the present. For him, the event was an unfortunate case, an elderly man's heart failing under the stress of life. He could not or would not imagine the small economies of the kitchen as sources of national history. His hand signed documents, and the world continued as though the plantation's private ledger had not been altered by the hand of one of the servants. But in the quiet places, the places that have no ledger, Benedita's choice travelled. Travellers who worked on riverboats heard the story recited by women who sold fruit on the docks. In small coastal towns, fishermen spoke of a woman who had disappeared in a boat and then reappeared in the accounts of a quilombo. With each telling the details shifted. Sometimes she returned to rescue a cousin. Sometimes she taught children to read certain plants. Sometimes she died young in the woods, her bones unmarked. The multiplicity of endings made the story less about a single truth and more about the imagination of freedom. For the Cenzala, the variations were a way to keep the story alive and unowned by the Casa Grande's attempt at erasure. There are ethical knots that never wholly untie. Some in the Cenzala later spoke of Benedita with a complex tenderness. Yes, justice had been administered in a sense that the courts refused to provide, yet the act had ripples, a family's grief, a daughter's orphaned moment of sorrow, the tightening of security in the Casa Grande that made life harder for those who remained. Joanna recognized this complexity in the same breath she taught the names of plants. We do what we must, she would say, and then we live with what follows. That acceptance was not resignation, it was an acknowledgement that a moral world of neat judgments rarely exists under the weight of structural violence. People make choices inside constricted possibilities, and those choices must be understood in the context that made them possible in the first place. Years later, when the story had been told so many times that no single speaker could claim ownership, the narrative acquired the qualities of a parable. Scholars much later would call it an example of resistance. Storytellers would call it poetic justice. Moralists would ask whether killing in the name of right could ever be right. But for those who had lived it, the women who had passed plates, The men who had watched their children grow without acknowledgement, the children who had played in the cane and later remembered a woman in a boat. The story remained stubbornly particular. A woman suffered, learned, chose, and then left. Whether one called that revenge or redemption depended on which ledger one consulted. In the end, the last strong image was not of a grand retribution, but of a small folded cloth. It was a cloth that had once been used to wipe a pan and later became a repository of a choice. It was found after Benedita had left, folded in the corner of her bed. Neat, ordinary, telling no secrets to those who did not know how to read its language. It was the thing people remembered when they needed to evoke her without naming her, the scrim of cotton, the scent that might be coffee or might be river mud. It was both relic and challenge, a reminder that the smallest objects can contain the largest decisions. The plantation continued. Time lightened some burdens and hardened others. The cane grew, the season turned, children were born and buried. Yet the story that spread from the Cenzala into the surrounding hills kept the memory of one woman alive in ways the Casa Grande's official histories could not anticipate. It refused a singular moral verdict. Those who heard it felt both the satisfaction of a long-denied recoupment and the uneasy recognition that the world in which such acts had to be taken remained unaltered in its larger injustice. If the title of the tale, Humiliated for Years Until She Took Her Revenge on Her Wedding Day, must answer itself, it does so in the quiet of a boat slipping from the bank at night. Revenge, for Benedita, was not a trumpet blast. It was a ledger balanced in the dark. The wedding day was both the stage and the instrument. It was the occasion that allowed patience to become decisive. Her act was not offered as exemplar. It was presented as the tragic logic of a life denied legal recourse, as a human attempt to claim a small justice where none had been available. What followed remained ambiguous. For some, Benedita was a heroine who rewrote the plantation's balance sheet. For others, she was a woman who had chosen a road no one would choose if given options that included justice and recognition. The story resistively refused to be neat, and that refusal became its largest lesson, that resistance grows in the seams of life, and that memory, oral, hidden, communal, will carry what written histories erase. And so in the Cenzala's songs, and in the hush of the river, Benedita's name, spoken low as if so a household might not hear, endured. Joanna Grossa lived to teach another generation, to point out roots that calm a fever and to hum a tune that kept a story whole. The Casa Grande kept its portrait of the colonel polished, and his family continued to punctuate social pages with the business of maintaining fortune. The truth lay shared across these records like light on water, fragmented, elusive, necessary. What remains after years of humiliation and a single decisive act? Perhaps the answer is as complicated as people themselves, a measure of reparation that is private and fragile, a community's memory that becomes a kind of law, an invitation to reckon with systems that create possibilities of only small, dangerous redress. Benedita's revenge did not redeem a nation. It did not alter the legal mechanism of power. It did, however, give something else, a demonstration that dignity can be weaponized not with spectacle, but with knowledge, patience, and timing, that invisibility can be a strategy as well as a wound. Listen for the way the story has been told by those who lived it. There is neither boast nor apology, only a careful naming. Theirs is not the rhetoric of moral certainty, but of lived necessity. In the years since, the song that tells of Benedita has survived not because it is tidy, but because it holds contradiction. The quietness of one woman's life, the thunder of what she corrected, and the lingering questions about what retribution means under centuries of oppression. The tale ends, as tales must, in a place of contemplation rather than closure. The river that carried Benedita away keeps flowing. The cane is harvested and replanted. The Casa Grande becomes a ruin or a museum, depending on time and taste. Oral memory does what it always has. It keeps what official records do not. In the end, whether she escaped to a Quilombo, found anonymity in a city, or took a different fate entirely, matters less than the fact that the community kept her act alive in their mouths and their songs. Humiliated for years, she found a way to answer what the law refused to correct. She did it on the day the plantation celebrated itself, binding her small act to a public spectacle that masked the deeper currents of power. The story of Benedita is not a simple celebration of revenge. It is a quiet, stern meditation on the ways people enact justice when institutions fail them. It asks us to sit with unease, to acknowledge the pain that leads to such choices and the imperfect ways we try to reckon with them. If this story moved you, and you want to hear more hidden histories told with care, share your thoughts below. Was Benedita an agent of justice, a question of vengeance, or both? Explore our playlist for other stories of resistance and memory, and join the conversation, because the past keeps teaching us how to understand present choices.